Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Dara had been hiking solo since before I knew her, which was 15 years, and she was the kind of hiker who made other hikers feel slightly embarrassed about their own preparation. She kept a gear log. She filed her routes with 2 separate people before any solo trip, her sister and me, with expected check-in times and bailout plans, and the specific level of redundancy that serious backcountry people build into their systems because they've thought carefully about what goes wrong and when. She was not someone who disappeared. She disappeared on a Thursday in September on a trail she'd done 4 times before, a 2-night route in the Karen Range that she'd described as her reset trail, the one she went back to when she needed the specific combination of difficulty and familiarity that a known trail provides. She checked in on Thursday evening from the first camp, a standard message, all good, weather clear. Nothing on Friday, nothing Saturday. Her sister called me Saturday afternoon, and by Sunday morning there was a search underway. They found her 11 days later. 11 days on a trail she'd planned to complete in 2, found by a ranger doing a sweep of a drainage system about 4 miles off the route she'd filed, in good physical condition that the medical team described as inconsistent with 11 days in that terrain without resupply. She was coherent when they found her, knew her name and the date within a day. Couldn't account for most of the 11 days beyond fragments that the doctors described as consistent with dissociative response to a traumatic experience. They kept her 2 nights for observation and released her, and she came home, and I went to see her the following afternoon. She seemed mostly herself. I want to be precise about that because mostly is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I didn't understand how much until later. She was Dara in every broad sense. Her voice and her humor and the specific way she held her coffee cup and the stories she told about the parts of the 11 days she did remember. Fragments that were disorienting in their content but delivered in her register. Her cadence, the particular way she narrated things that I'd been listening to for 15 years. The first wrong thing was small enough that I set it aside without examining it. She referenced a camping trip we'd taken together 5 years ago, a weekend in the Pella Mountains, and she said we'd camped by the lake on the second night. We hadn't camped by the lake. We'd planned to and turned back at the ridge because the weather had changed, and we'd camped in the lower valley instead, which we'd both complained about at the time because the valley site was exposed and the wind had kept us up. I mentioned this, and she looked at me with the specific expression of someone receiving a correction. They're not sure how to integrate, and said, "You're right. I don't know why I said the lake." 2 days later, she described a restaurant in the city that she said we'd gone to for her birthday 3 years ago. We'd gone to a different restaurant. I'd booked it specifically because she'd mentioned the place we ended up at, and I remembered the booking and the meal. When I said so, she apologized and said her memory was still scrambled from the trip, and her doctor had said to expect that. The doctor had said that. I'd been told the same thing. I set it aside, and I visited her regularly, and I paid attention in the way you pay attention to someone you love when they've been through something and you're monitoring for signs that they're recovering. The intrusion started in the second week. She described a place she'd never been, a coastal town, in the middle of a conversation about something unrelated, the description arriving with the easy familiarity of someone mentioning somewhere they'd spent time rather than somewhere they were inventing. She caught herself mid-description and stopped and said she didn't know where that came from. The following visit, she described a person I'd never heard of, a friend, from what she said, was college, with the same easy familiarity and the same mid-sentence stop and the same she doesn't know where that came from. I started writing things down, not because I'd reached any conclusion, but because the pattern was becoming something I needed to track rather than hold in memory. The wrong details about our shared history were one category. The intrusions, the places and people and experiences that weren't hers were another. Over the course of 3 weeks, I accumulated enough of both categories that the pattern was undeniable, and the undeniable pattern was this. The wrong details about our shared history were being replaced by details that weren't hers, and the replacement was consistent and directional, not random noise, but a coherent set of experiences belonging to someone specific. I looked up the Karen Range and missing hikers and the specific drainage where Dara had been found, and found what I was afraid I'd find, or the beginning of it. A news article from 7 years ago about a hiker who'd gone missing in the same range, on a route that took them through the same drainage system, and who had never been found. The article was brief, the kind of coverage a single missing person gets when the search concludes without resolution. A few paragraphs, a photograph, a name. The name was Petra Vane. I read the article and then I searched for more coverage and found a longer piece from the period of the search, which had run for 9 days before being scaled back. The longer piece had more detail about Petra Vane, her life, her background, the people who'd been searching for her. A graduate student, 28 at the time of her disappearance, originally from a coastal town that matched the description Dara had produced mid-sentence. A close friend who'd been central to the search effort, described in the article by a nickname that wasn't the friend's name. The nickname was the same name Dara had used twice when she'd called me by the wrong name. She'd caught herself both times and apologized and said she didn't know where that had come from. I sat with this for 2 days before I went to Dara. I needed the 2 days because presenting what I'd found required a framing I didn't have, a way of saying, I think the memories of a woman who died on the mountain you disappeared on are coming through you without that sentence being the first sentence, without it landing with the full weight of its own impossibility before I had anything else to offer alongside it. I went on a Sunday afternoon. I'd printed the article, which felt simultaneously necessary and absurd, the kind of thing you bring to a conversation you're not sure is real. I sat across from her at her kitchen table, and I told her what I'd found, and I watched her face while I told her. She knew the name before I said it, not after. Before. I said I found something about a missing hiker on the same trail, and she said, Petra. And then she stopped and looked at the table, and the quality of the silence that followed was the most frightening thing I'd encountered in the 3 weeks since she'd come back. More frightening than any of the wrong details or the intrusions, because the silence had the quality of someone who has said something they shouldn't have been able to say and is now deciding what to do about having said it. I asked her how she knew that name. She said she didn't know. She said she'd heard me say missing hiker and the name had been there, which she said with the same she doesn't know where that came from framing, and with something underneath it this time that the previous instances hadn't had. A quality of the framing becoming insufficient to contain what was actually happening. I showed her the article. She read it in a way that wasn't reading, the eyes moving across text that she already knew rather than eyes receiving new information. She stopped at the photograph and stayed there for long enough that I counted the seconds without meaning to. 38 seconds, looking at a photograph of a woman who had disappeared on a mountain 7 years ago. She said she had a cat named after a poet. The article didn't mention a cat. The article didn't mention anything about Petra Vane's domestic life beyond the coastal town she was originally from. Dara said it with the flat certainty of someone reporting a fact they have direct knowledge of, and I asked her how she knew that, and she said she didn't know, she just knew. And then she said she couldn't remember her own middle name. She couldn't. She tried for about a minute, visibly trying. The effort of someone reaching for something that should be in immediate reach and finding nothing. And she couldn't produce her own middle name, which I knew, which I'd known for 15 years, which she'd had for her entire life before she went up that mountain. I spent the following Sunday with her doing the thing I'd spent the week deciding whether to do. I brought photographs, the accumulated evidence of 15 years of friendship, and I sat with her, and we went through them, and I told the stories behind them, and she listened, and sometimes she remembered with what looked like genuine recovery, and sometimes she looked at photographs of herself in places she'd been and people she'd known, and received the information with the polite attention of someone being shown someone else's life. It helped for the evening. She was more herself by the time I left than she'd been when I arrived. The process of being reminded seeming to shore up something that was eroding rather than re-establishing something already lost. A distinction that I drove home thinking about with a particular coldness. The message came at 2 a.m. from her phone, her number, a message that said, "I know you're trying to help her. I can feel you trying. I want you to know I'm not trying to take over. I don't know how to stop." And then, she's still here. I can feel her too. But there's less of her than there was last week. And then, after a pause long enough that I thought the messages were done, "You called me by her name in the photograph tonight. Twice," she noticed. I hadn't called her by the wrong name. I'd been careful, specifically careful, the whole evening. I'd used Dara's name consciously and consistently as a form of anchoring. The message had called me by a name Dara had never used for me, the nickname from the article. The name Petra Vane's closest friend had gone by. I've been living with this for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of visiting Dara twice a week and watching the ratio change in ways I can track because I've been tracking them. The number of things she knows correctly about her own life against the number of things from a life that ended on a mountain 7 years ago. And the ratio is not moving in the right direction. She remembered her middle name last week, said it unprompted in the middle of a conversation, and looked briefly triumphant in the way of someone who has recovered something they lost and knows it. I told her that was great and meant it and held on to it the way you hold on to the good weeks during a long illness, knowing it's not the trajectory, but grateful for the data point. She couldn't remember the name of the restaurant from her birthday 3 years ago, the one I'd booked specifically because she'd mentioned wanting to go. She asked me which restaurant, and I told her, and she wrote it down. I don't know what is happening to my friend. I have a description of it, the mechanism as I understand it, the memories of a woman who died on a mountain arriving in the body of a woman who disappeared on the same mountain and came back, and the arriving displacing rather than supplementing, the new set of memories operating like a slow replacement rather than an addition. I have a description, and I don't have a framework that the description fits into, not one I'd known before this started. The last message from her phone, which arrived 3 days ago at just past midnight, said, "She asked me today who I was. She could feel me. She asked out loud in the room alone, 'Who's there?' And I didn't know how to answer. I haven't told Dara about the messages. I haven't decided what telling her would do and whether it would help or accelerate something I don't know how to slow. I've been calling her every day instead, sometimes twice. The calls functioning as the photographs did, as shoring up, as reminding, as saying your name is Dara, and here is your life, and here is what you know, and here is who you are. She answered the call this morning and said my name correctly and asked how I was doing with the specific quality of asking that had always been hers, the version of the question that wanted the actual answer rather than the performative one. And I held on to that for the full length of the call, and for an hour after, she's still in there. The message said so. And my 15 years of knowing her says so. And I'm choosing to believe both. The ratio is moving in the wrong direction. She's still in there. I don't know how long I have to hold both of those things at once.